A couple of months ago, Bryan did something very unusual. For those of you who don't know, he's the longevity guy who spends millions trying to reverse aging, and he kind of became famous for getting blood transfusions from his son. Well, that guy recently took 5 grams of psilocybin mushrooms, strapped on a brain scanning headset, and tracked hundreds of biomarkers, all while live streaming the whole thing to millions and listening to Grimes DJ live. If you watched it, it had the vibe of a futuristic reality TV experiment. It was pretty bizarre, but it was also a useful cultural artifact because it sits right on the fault line of a shift that's been quietly happening in the science and the story we tell ourselves about psychedelics. Now, for a long time, psychedelics belonged to the mind. They were about consciousness, therapy, trauma, meaning, spiritual experience, and perception. If they had a medical future, it was in psychiatry. Longevity belonged to something else entirely. That was about cellular maintenance, biomarkers, inflammation, DNA repair, and mitochondria. Essentially the housekeeping layer of staying alive. 2 different worlds, 2 different vocabularies, and 2 very different kinds of people. And then in 2025, a paper came out that made it harder to keep those 2 worlds neatly separated, and it's a study that I believe inspired Bryan to start experimenting with psilocybin mushrooms. Researchers at Emory University and Baylor College of Medicine, led by Louise Hecker, published a study in NPJ Aging that is probably one of the most interesting early signals in what you could call psychedelic longevity research. Now, it didn't prove anything in humans, but it did present evidence that psilocybin is not just a mind-altering agent, but rather a whole-body modulator that affects some of the same cellular machinery evolved in aging. They looked at psilocin, which is the active form psilocybin becomes in the body, and they tested it at 2 levels: isolated human cells in a dish and on older mice. In the cells, psilocin extended cellular lifespan substantially depending on the dose. It preserved telomere length, which is one of the markers that people use when they talk about cellular aging. It reduced oxidative stress and improved DNA stability. It increased SIRT1, a protein that shows up again and again in discussions of longevity because it's involved in regulating metabolism and stress responses, and it tends to rise during caloric restriction, one of the few interventions that reliably extends lifespan in multiple organisms. In the mice, the effect was even more striking. Monthly psilocybin treatment increased survival in older mice from 50% to 80%. The treated mice also looked younger in visible ways like smoother coats, darker fur regrowth, and healthier skin. And even when the treatment began later in life, the mice still improved. Now, this is intriguing in itself, but the detail that changes the texture of the whole story is that the researchers also applied psilocin to fibroblasts in a petri dish. So cells with no brain, no connection to a nervous system, and no subjective experience. And they still saw lifespan extension and metabolic improvements. If you seriously consider these implications, you can feel an entire cultural framing start to strain. Because we've gotten comfortable with a particular story. It's one that says psychedelics do something profound to the mind, and then the mind does something downstream to the body through our behavior, relationships, stress response, meaning, and all this softer, higher level stuff. This result doesn't disprove that story, but it does add to it. It suggests there may be something more direct happening at the level of basic biological maintenance, not as an abstract mind-body connection idea, but an actual cellular stress response shifting in cells that aren't having a mystical insight. Now, modern culture has a habit of treating the body like a machine. You identify a broken part, you fix the part, you measure inputs and outputs, you optimize, you extract, and essentially you control. That approach has given us real miracles and it deserves respect, but it has a blind spot because living systems don't behave like machines. They behave like ecosystems. They adapt, they generate, they respond through networks. If you change one node, the whole network shifts. And the deeper you go, the more you find relationships rather than levers. Psychedelics, interestingly, seem to sit in this relational territory. The Emory Baylor team pointed out that psilocybin's famous target, the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, is not just found in the brain. It shows up in other tissues too: immune cells, endothelial cells, fibroblasts, and throughout the metabolic organs, which is interesting because it implies that when you take psilocybin, the body is not waiting politely for the brain to have a transcendent experience. The entire system is responding directly. They also found mitochondrial related improvements, which, if you care about aging in any first principles way, is hard to overstate. Mitochondria are more than a biohacker trend. They're an energy infrastructure of the cell, and when energy production is robust, cells can repair, regulate inflammation, maintain structure, and handle stress. When energy production declines, everything else becomes more fragile. So now we have a picture emerging that is less like psilocybin rewires the brain and more like psilocybin resets the entire system. They nudge multiple layers at once: cellular stress responses, inflammatory signaling, mitochondrial function, as well as the brain networks that shape perception, behavior, and meaning. And if that's even partly true, it changes the stakes, because it means the current cultural box we've put psychedelics in, as therapy drugs, mind drugs, or consciousness drugs, is way too narrow. And it means the longevity box that we've put aging in, cellular housekeeping, biomarker management, might also be too narrow. Which brings us back to Bryan Johnson. Johnson's first experiment was essentially the most Silicon Valley version of a psychedelic trip imaginable. He collected data at multiple time points using kernel flow sensors, watching changes in brain activity during the peak, the come down, the end of the day, and the following morning. His hypothesis was interesting, and it's the kind of hypothesis a culture obsessed with longevity will eventually have to confront. What if the mental state itself is not just a sideshow, but part of the regulation story? Not as positive thinking in a shallow sense, but as a measurable shift in how the nervous system tunes the body. About 3 or 4 hours in, his brain scans showed his prefrontal cortex dimming, which roughly maps onto reduced executive control. Meanwhile, his sensory and motor regions became highly active and connected. The default mode network, often associated with self-referential thinking and the narrative sense of me, began to quiet, and Johnson's subjective report matched this pattern. He described his consciousness as dialed up. He became absorbed in ordinary sensory phenomena like light passing through water. Touch became meaningful. Food tasted vivid. He felt an impulse to deploy his senses into the world, he said. Now, it's easy to mock this because it sounds like someone discovering novelty for the first time at age 40-something, but that's also the point. A lot of aging, psychologically at least, is the slow narrowing of perception. Not because life becomes objectively dull, but because the brain becomes more efficient. It builds shortcuts, it filters down, and it predicts and compresses. So you get better at survival, but you also lose some contact with the immediate aliveness. On psychedelics, those filters relax. The system lets in more data than usual, and the world becomes strange again, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, and often both. Johnson described a kind of return to childhood perception, and then later, as his prefrontal cortex came back online, he shifted from pure sensation to meaning-making. He moved into reflection about mortality, evolution, and the future. The brain did what it always does. It tried to integrate chaos into narrative. The next morning, the afterglow still showed altered connectivity. He said he felt open, calm, less defended, and more creatively fluent. Now, you could treat all of this as an interesting mental story and stop there. People have been telling versions of this story for decades. What makes Johnson relevant is that he also tracked his body. In his second experiment, he reported changes in biomarkers that, while still n=1, are provocative. Markers of inflammation dropped. Stress hormones dropped in the days after, even if they spiked during the acute experience. He saw shifts in estradiol, which is nuanced and context dependent, but often has neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory associations. He also did thermal imaging, producing these strange maps of temperature changes across his face and body during the trip, which reflect the shifts in autonomic activity and blood flow. Now, none of this is a clinical trial. It's a highly resourced self-experiment in public, which is its own modern genre. But if you hold it next to the Emery-Baylor findings, you get a plausible lens for why Johnson's metabolic metrics might shift in such a sustained way. If psilocybin is acting on serotonin receptors in metabolic organs, improving oxidative stress responses, enhancing mitochondrial function in muscle and fat, and simultaneously changing brain circuits involved in stress regulation and homeostasis, then you would expect systemic effects that outlast the drug itself. This is where the conversation gets delicate, because it's tempting to leap into conclusions, but we're not there yet. A compelling mouse study and a fascinating self-experiment do not equal a medical future. There are many variables to consider. Dose, context, and risk all matter. Psychedelics can destabilize people psychologically, especially those with certain vulnerabilities. And what is safe in a controlled setting is not automatically safe as a casual lifestyle experiment. So the responsible stance is curiosity with restraint. But curiosity is warranted because there is a deeper pattern here that feels very important. We often talk about longevity as if it's only a matter of cellular housekeeping. Telomeres, methylation, senescent cells, and inflammation. Now, these things are real and meaningful, but this framing can turn life into machinery maintenance, where the goal becomes keeping the machine running. And that's a strange goal because the machine metaphor breaks down precisely where the human part begins. Because humans don't just persist. Unlike machines, we interpret, we feel, we connect, and we create meaning. What Johnson seems to be circling, perhaps without fully naming it, is that aging also has a psychological dimension that essentially looks like rigidity. The calcification of mental patterns, the narrowing of curiosity, the fading of emotional range, the gradual loss of intimacy with the present moment. There's research that points in this direction without needing mysticism. Measures like optimism, purpose, well-being, and social connection correlate with reduced mortality risk and better cardiovascular outcomes. Chronic stress and depression are associated with inflammatory changes and accelerated aging markers. Psychedelic therapy in some contexts has been associated with shifts in biological age metrics alongside improvements in mental health. This doesn't mean that happiness causes longevity in a simple way. It means something more basic. Whatever we are not two separate systems stapled together. And this is the reveal hiding inside the weird spectacle of a biohacker tripping to electronic music. For 2 decades, we've had 2 separate cultural stories. One says psychedelics expand consciousness, they dissolve rigid identity, they renew a sense of connection, they can help heal trauma and depression. The other story says longevity is cellular, it's mitochondrial function, inflammation, and DNA repair. This emerging research suggests that these stories may not be separate at all. Psychedelics appear capable of influencing both the subjective experience of being alive and the underlying metabolic machinery that supports life, which points to a conclusion that is more philosophical than it first appears. Consciousness expansion and lifespan extension may be inextricably linked, not because psychedelics are magic, but because the boundary between mind and body is more of a convenience than a truth. If the nervous system is the interface through which you experience reality, and if that same nervous system is also regulating inflammation, metabolism, immune function, and hormonal signaling, then changing the quality of experience is also changing the state of the organism, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. So maybe the most interesting thing about this whole moment is not whether psilocybin becomes the next geroprotective drug. That will take time, research, and humility. The more interesting thing is what it reveals about how we should think. Modern life trains us towards extraction, optimize the output, minimize the friction, hack the system. This leads us to treat the body like hardware and the mind like software. But living systems do not thrive through domination. They thrive through relationships, feedback loops, diversity, adaptation, regeneration, and repair. Fungi understand this better than we do. Mycelial networks aren't trying to win. They're trying to stay in dialogue with their environment long enough to keep regenerating. If psychedelics have something to teach the longevity world, it might be that extending life without expanding aliveness is a hollow project, and that expanding aliveness without respecting biology is naive. The deeper invitation is integration, to see that vitality is not only about how long your cells last, but about how awake you are inside the life those cells are supporting. In that sense, Bryan Johnson's mushroom livestream is less an oddity and more a symbol. A man devoted to measurement discovering that the deepest markers of youth might include wonder, connection, and the capacity to feel the world freshly again. Not as a sentimental aside, but as biology, as metabolism, as the nervous system returning, even briefly, to a state where regeneration becomes possible. What a time to be alive. Click the links below to learn more about the studies mentioned in this video, to read my blog, and to sign up to my weekly newsletter about all things mushrooms, The Spore Report.